ahead.
We're ready, whether we're ready or not. Okay, now I'm going to move to where I'm actually on camera. Whoop. Tell me if you can't hear us. I just need to do a sound and video check because, as you can see, it's the lovely Miss Rita and I today. And usually this is being done on someone else's computer, which is also why I'm lacking the broadcast images. So if you can't hear us, let me know. You can see my mouth moving, so I'm flapping my gums, and hopefully actually something is going across to them. And nobody is saying, like, oh, they can hear us. Good.
Yay.
Okay. Then, so we have the two of us, and we have a chat, which we can probably read from here.
You might. I can't read that.
Okay.
I'm just going to take off my glasses, because why?
Because they're beautiful glasses.
Thank you.
I love that red spider web. That's so
They're
awesome.
fun.
So, yes, it's just Rita and I, and because Jonna is in Italy, and also I think exhausted, and Kortnee has run off to the point where the two of them are like literally on a globe like this. They could stick a pin through it.
Antipodian, is that what they call it?
I think so, yes. Yeah, just about that far apart, as far apart as you can get anyway.
That's amazing.
So, yes, and it's kind of fun that we can actually talk to one another like that. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, I remember growing up in the days before the internet, as I have my cane, and when long-distance phone calls were horribly expensive. And I have family that's scattered from Alaska all the way to New England and even in England. So talking to them on a regular basis, you wrote letters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's a dead art.
I had a pen pal from junior high.
Yeah.
We're still friends.
Oh, that's amazing.
And, yeah, he was in Belgium. I was in French class, and our French teacher, I guess there was some network or something that coordinated between native French speakers who were learning English and native English speakers who were learning French. So we became pen friends, and I've come to visit them in Belgium. They've come over to visit here, and it's been a nice friendship.
Yeah, and that's wonderful too, because I mean, not only did you get to talk to each other, but you made friends like that.
Not only that, their children all have come to the school in the United States for graduate work and that sort of thing, and they've hit me up to look at just to proofread their application letters and that sort of thing, their statements or essays for applying for places like Stanford and things like that. So it's been a great compliment, but it's been nice to help them. Although their children, not even at the age of 20, were all more fluent in English than most of my students. I'm going to be honest.
I think that seems to be a trend of English as a second language. They take it more seriously, whereas if we just grow up speaking it, it's like taking medicine to have to learn how to make English work for you. It's at least for most kids. I mean, not everybody.
Well, it's also incredible how much of what idioms that people hear so often, they don't know how to spell them correctly. And I'm trying to think of things that I see in the utmost. Is morphing into upmost, upmost, and people, they don't know the utmost, and maybe it's connection to utter or extremity.
Right.
There's some real gaps in the knowledge. They hear it, they know what it means, but they don't know how it connects to the language, and then they certainly don't know how to spell it.
I've seen things like that. Free rein. Giving someone free rein.
Right.
I've seen it spelled, and this is actually more complicated, REIGN.
Right.
Like it's someone that's got a crown on and they're reigning, and it's a free rein. But it's actually a horseman term of letting the horse have his head.
Have his own lead,
Yeah, so, but I see a lot of that, and it is one of those pet peeves in books.
You don't see it as much as I do.
Oh, I'm sure I don't. But when I'm reading books, I'll come across stuff like
That's
this.
That's it. It's like, obviously, there's even editors that established publishing companies.
Yes.
Says the lady whose book is needs some editing on Amazon, but it's one of those things.
I'm reading the chat, so Michael points out, for all intents and purposes becomes for all intensive purposes.
Yes.
For those really serious purposes.
Right. One of the things that I do with my students, especially the ones who are more gifted, but who make these kinds of faux pas, I guess can you call it that in writing, I suggest they take a technical writing course. Technical writing courses are tough, and they're tough for a reason. They're hard to get an A in, but they will refine you as a writer, and I think that's something that anyone serious about writing should do.
Yeah,
because you'll hammer out a lot of things. You'll learn, shockingly, embarrassingly, how much of what you think is clever writing is actually cliched. It's kind of sad, but
well, and the other thing too, because I mean, I came into this when I went back to school and I got the science degree. Science writing is a whole other thing,
right?
And when you're writing for an academic paper, you're writing to a very different audience than what's now called SciComm or science communication, which is where you're writing for a layman audience, but introducing complicated scientific concepts. And so that ability seems to be vanishingly rare.
Well, what's difficult and in the field of technical writing is finding people who are adept at the technology or the science behind the field that they're editing, that have an understanding of the math or engineering things that are being discussed. So finding somebody who has the language skills and also those technical skills can be a challenge, as I understand it.
It can be a challenge, and I'm chuckling. James Copley says that he's trying to eat and type, and presumably listen to us at the same time. So that is multitasking.
That is indeed.
And
which task is winning is the question.
That is a question. And then somebody says that he calls parts of his job geek to English translation.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, but Sanford has described his job as something similar to that. Not that he was doing the writing end of it, but just taking what the engineers were saying and translating that to an audience that didn't necessarily know where the engineers were coming from.
Yeah.
Speaker to geeks.
Yeah.
I've run into that. It is, and it's interesting because when I was doing that degree, I was also taking classes in art and graphic design, and not just like art appreciation, although I took the art of China, Japan, and Korea, and that was wonderful. I love that. But taking like drawing classes. And I was going to take a technical drawing class, which is like English to technical writing. The technical drawing is to the observational drawing. It's very, very challenging.
It's sort of a more pedagogy, like how to draw a line.
Well, and it has to do with you have your angles and your perspectives, and it gets really complicated. Then there's math in my drawing. And
yeah. You've got perspective is a tough thing, especially when you've got the I don't know.
Well, you get the vanishing point in the horizon, and it depends on your point of view, and it's fun to think about it, but it's really, really difficult to actually execute.
Yeah.
So, but one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about actually came out of a comment thread on Facebook that you may or may not remember, but somebody was talking about how they had been taught to hate reading by being forced to read classic literature that they really didn't like. And I had commented that, sorry, Mom, because Mom's watching, I had commented on that thread that I had really grown to dislike Hemingway because when I was in about 6th grade, Mom made me read The Old Man and the Sea. And I did not like And to this day, I'm really not that thrilled with Hemingway. But you came in on that thread, and your point was that there's much to love about classic literature,
Mhm.
and I know that that's something that you teach. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on teaching literature so that people love it.
Well, you know what? I'll say this. I said this to my students today in my English literature survey class. We're doing the Victorian period right now, and I've told them that I've squandered so much of the course on Jane Austen that I've told them that the rest of this I've got 4 more classes, Friday and then Monday, Wednesday, Friday next week, and I told them today that I'm going to fit 10 pounds of sugar in this 5-pound bag. I'm gonna compress what I need to get done. But I was talking to them about the importance of recognizing that we have commonalities with the people who are doing the writing. I don't think that people are fundamentally different than they were 2,000-3,000 years ago. I think we're the same creatures, same needs, same instincts, same poor habits. Actually, we've invented new terrible habits. But time wasting, I'm sure, is not a new thing and that kind of thing. But one thing I was telling them is that especially whatever they decide their life is about, whatever they're doing, they should strive, they should aspire to the level of expression of someone like Emily Bronte, who was a magnificent poet. And within an economy of space, in something like 12 lines, she wrote, so sorry, I've got to turn this volume off there. Sorry. In an economy of lines, she would compose these just little universes of these realms of thought, this idea that is incredibly spiritual, and yet is not preaching, it's not finger waving. There's one, I can't tell you. I'd have to look it up, and I should have brought this because I'm terrible at mangling brilliant poetry. But there's one that's to words to the effect, I'm most alive when I'm the least here. And she's saying that when her mind is drifting and she's considering the breadth of her soul and all of this, and she's not feeling like she's in this body or in this place, in this prison of clay, basically. Mm-hmm. She's the most alive, she's the most herself. And I think that's phenomenal. And she wrote this when she was 18. And I'm telling my students, she has no greater capacity than you do. She maybe had a different frame of reference, a different background. But if you aspire to make something, to write something, to be involved in some creative pursuit, whatever you do, pursue it with that level of intensity and self-belief, because your views on life, your own expression in this world is just as legitimate as these people. And look at them as an inspiration, because what she wrote was transcendently beautiful and I think phenomenal.
And I was fascinated. I was listening to a podcast, and unfortunately I don't remember which one now, but they were talking about the Brontes. Mm-hmm. And they essentially all started writing together, the girls and their brother, and they were essentially doing a role-playing game.
They did. Every one of them started writing their own stories as soon as they could write. Mm-hmm. As soon as they learned writing. But they did create these little worlds. Yes. And the other sister, Anne, wrote a novel. She wrote her 2 novels, I think, placed in one of their little ethereal, yes, Avalon kind of worlds, yes.
And I just found that really fascinating, because that resonates with something that I hear from a lot of current authors, that mm-hmm. they either started writing out of role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, mm-hmm. or that they use those games to strengthen and build their writing and their worlds. So it was one of those things that you were talking about, humans being the same, and that really resonated. Of mm-hmm. these brilliant authors who in some ways, because their life was very isolated and constrained, mm-hmm. they learned to live in that world of imagination.
Well, the Brontes were a remarkable family, and they did live quite isolated and there was, of course, much sickness and death.
Yes.
The two eldest sisters died. I think Emily was born in 1819 something. I mean, it's remarkable because I think of them kind of as contemporaries of Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, but she was dying around the time they were being born, that kind of thing, or she's winding down, that kind of thing. But they were very isolated. Their father was a clergyman, and he was not. They were not wealthy, and there was much sickness. Most of them died of tuberculosis.
Yeah.
What they called consumption, which is horrific because you basically cough yourself to death, and you cough so much that you cannot keep fat on your body. You cannot get enough energy for all of the work your body's doing to express the fluid in the lungs. It's miserable. And yet they created these remarkable worlds, and they lived in their heads. And I feel like this is one way that the internet has been interesting, is that it gives us access to, especially if you're prone to idols or flights of fancy, it gives you more of that, like a more sense of the space where you're living inside your head, if that makes any sense.
I think you can construct it on the internet. I mean, I'm not sure that's what you meant there.
No,
but,
it's not.
Okay.
I'm not talking about a reimagining of a physical space. I'm talking about that. I think we are most alive in our minds.
Yeah.
And I think that the physical trappings I don't know. I'm not verbalizing this very well.
I know for me, fiction was a way to escape quite frequently, and to step out of myself. And I used to do that as a reader. And then as a writer, I don't necessarily want to go and live in any of the worlds that I write, but I really enjoy going there and then writing down the stories that come from that. Come from making mind travels.
There's a really fantastic, I think, rendition of Northanger Abbey, which was an unfinished novel of Jane Austen's, but it was published posthumously. But there's a really good film version on YouTube that you can watch free that I think was around 2012, 2009, something like that. But the character in it, it's very much a Gothic novel, and it has those, the mysterious, the wondering about, is this person a murderer? Did they kill their wife? And this young girl who's obsessed with reading the Gothic novels that were popular at that moment, and Jane Austen is playing with that, and she's kind of toying with it and making fun of it, and I mean, it's kind of a loving send up, it's not a biting criticism or something like that, but you have this young girl who nearly ruins herself with the wrong kind of fellow, and as happens in the Jane Austen novel, as we all know, but she ends up kind of redeemed, or kind of like it ends up all right, and she ends up with the right fellow who's a good guy, and he's like, now he's he's kind of like, you gotta calm down a little bit, but she's in the novel or in the film they show her so wonderfully, because she's this pretty young girl, and she's taken Bath. Everybody goes to Bath in Jane Austen novels, but she goes with a wealthy relation to go off and for the season, and that's when she meets all the excitement and adventure. But she's also quite taken with these books, and in one of the first scenes, she's laying in the grass with the novel, and her bosom is just heaving, and she's kind of flushed, and she's imagining being swooped up by a highwayman, who's like robbing the carriage she's riding in and everything, and then her little brother and sister come in like, what are you doing? And then she's like, nothing, and she's acting indignant, like I'm just, it was funny.
It is funny, and it's interesting because I have not read a lot of Jane Austen. I bounced off of it hard when I was young, and so most of my Austen appreciation has come through. I have a lot of friends and my mother who are very enthusiastic fans, and but on the other hand, Gothic novels I wound up reading well, partly because, I mean, I've talked before on the broadcast of I would read anything. And so we had Barbara Cartland novels that would come in these boxes of books that we'd occasionally randomly get because they were cheap. And she was a very prolific writer.
She was. She absolutely
amazingly prolific writer. But I see that thread, which we were talking about this when we were doing the romance novel episodes, the thread of the Gothic goes right through to the modern novels.
Because it's exciting.
It is. And it gives women especially, I think, are prone to this more than guys necessarily, because they go for a whole other genre and subset. But women, I think, they like that little frisson of fear when they don't necessarily have that in their daily lives.
Yeah.
So,
well,
yeah.
You know, this is going to be a weird rabbit chase, but I listened to different people who talk about the way that the way that our lifestyle is not healthy for the animal that we are, and they were talking about that it's natural to feel hungry, that before there were grocery stores and there was such availability and luxury and comfort and relative safety, that people would have had a more adrenaline experiences in life, and they would have been hungry a lot more and all of that. So maybe there's something in the limbic system, your lizard brain, that's kind of that sort of needs to get the juices going through the pipes or something like that.
No, I would totally agree with that, because there is certainly a correlation between autoimmune disorders and lack of exposure to disease and parasites. Our body essentially turns on itself. And in order to reset the sense of hunger, it's very difficult for some people because they don't know true hunger. So they they assume that what they're feeling is hunger, when it might just be that they're a little peckish. So you have to reset that. And I'm going to move slightly so I can actually read the chat. There we go. Now I can read the chat, because I can squint at it from over there, but unfortunately my eyes are no longer going to pick up the chat. So, which is the conversation is still about being forced to read, and that's the thing that I see a lot from people, is that they were forced to read books that were horrible, and they resent that. And I know for probably everyone watching this, it didn't stop them. But I know that there's also people that have told me that, oh, I don't read because it's not fun for me. And which is, I find sad, because I love reading. So
I think you just haven't found the right book.
I think that's true. I mean, this is actually something that we were told when we were doing the postcard books. Rob Powell took a bunch to a convention that wasn't a literary convention, and he had people telling him, oh, I don't read. And he's like, well, then try this. There's not much reading in it. And it's with the little 50-word stories. And those are, like you were talking about, the 12-line poems. Incredibly difficult to do. A whole story in that short of a thing. But somebody that wouldn't normally read is like, I can read 50 words. So,
right.
Yeah.
You just need that little way in, kind of auger in, and kind of make it alive.
Yeah, and Kortnee Lady Lark says, literature is a conversation across the years. Reading lets you experience things without actually having to go through it, which is what we were just talking about, is the fact that you can vicariously experience things through reading. And I've actually seen studies that show that you can improve your buzzword, but it is essentially the emotional intelligence. You can improve your ability to empathize with your fellow human being through reading fiction.
Well, there's also the fact that you can deal with some dangerous characters, like the romance trope, the bad boy, and I mean, you can deal with you can work through some things, or at least have a little peek into a certain experience with that you never, of course, want to be involved in. And you look at how much of literature that's been ridiculously popular has silly, unhinged, mentally disordered elements like Scarlett O'Hara, Gone with the Wind,
And
was
massive, not
monstrous.
only in selling, but the book itself was huge.
The book was massive, and the film was just huge, and of course, Vivian Leigh was amazing. She was,
Yes.
but she was great at Unhinged. See Streetcar Named Desire, and she did that very well. And also, people genuinely, so many people think she was American. Is amazing.
Yeah.
And but she was a Royal Shakespeare Company trained actress, stage actress. She was phenomenal. But she was a little cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs too.
And I think a lot of the really big actors and actresses were for various reasons.
Yeah.
I don't know that it necessarily has a correlation to being able to be a good actor, because you can put yourself in that headspace of the really good ones.
Yeah.
Were the character for however long they had to be.
Well, she was also she was married to Laurence Olivier, who's highly problematic and a neurotic person himself, I think, or at least had kind of a tempestuous personality. He ended up fooling around on her and marrying Joan Plowright, who I absolutely adore. I loved her in Enchanted April. In fact, I think her work as an older actress was so much better than her younger stuff. She was magnificent. And that's another thing I was thinking about. You know how actresses are always, saying, well, they've got a limited shelf life. They've got to get all of their roles in while they're young. And I'm like, what about the old lady roles?
Helen Mirren.
Exactly.
And the other one whose name I can't remember, but they're contemporaries, and they are phenomenal as fierce little old ladies. I mean,
I know who you're talking about. She played M on James Bond.
Yes. And I can't remember who it is. Maybe somebody in the chat will tell us.
She was, by the way, there's a magnificent from the 1970s. There's a magnificent video of A Midsummer Night's Dream with her playing Titania, and she's naked, I think, or at least topless. She's at least partially nude, and she just looks amazing. But she was just in a regular TV show for a long time in the 80s on British television. She was just a workaday actress, but I think
Judi Dench. Dame Judi Dench. Thank you.
And isn't she gorgeous?
Yes, and Katharine Hepburn has just come up, and Angela Lansbury, who was performing right up until close to the end of her life. I mean, I can think of quite a few actresses off the top of my head that were performing well into their twilight years.
Well, I never even heard of Miriam Margolyes, although I think I'd seen a couple of things with her in it. But she's not sexy like Helen Mirren, or at least not conventional sexy, although she's got a very sexy brain. But she's got some outrageous stories too. She's really hilarious. But she played in the Harry Potter movies. She was the lady in the gardening scene where they've got the mandrake plant and everything. Yes. But she's not conventionally pretty, but she's a remarkable, brilliant talent, incredible actress.
Well, okay, and Harry Potter. When we're talking about classic literature, because I was going to ask you a question, and this will lead into it, maybe, or I may just ramble off.
That's fine too.
Harry Potter, I mean, I know and you know that Harry Potter is very derivative. But when I was seeing the whole phenomenon of Harry Potter roll across the country as far as the U.S. goes, and seeing how big it was and how it got everybody back to reading, because it wasn't just being read by children.
No, I read it.
Yes,
because my other adult friends were reading it.
Right.
My adult friends who had no children.
And I saw, when I went back to college, Harry Potter had already been out well over a decade at that point, and I would see college students walking around on campus carrying one of the Harry Potter books, and that's what they were reading. And I thought that was just a wonderful thing, because I think J.K. Rowling single-handedly revived this enthusiasm for literacy in a generation by that set of books.
She did, and I think she was. I think one of the things that she did that I thought was quite a feat, and I don't know if it was by design or if it just happened that way, but as Harry ages, as he grows, her writing matures. Her writing becomes more complex and more polished.
Yes.
Then, so you're reading a better constructed book by the end than the first volume, but you kind of don't care. It feels like you're seeing. I mean,
you're watching the kids.
Yeah,
grow
the
up.
Development fits the maturity of the children or the maturation of the children. It's really amazing.
It works beautifully. I mean, you can tell that she really worked on her writing craft, and I think you're right that there was definitely a maturity, and I think I like the fact that they didn't choose to go back and edit that out.
Mm-hmm.
I think it does work really well with that.
Yeah.
With the kids growing up too.
Mm-hmm.
But then that leads into the question I was going to ask about classic literature is I can't stand the phrase an instant classic. So a book that's just been released is already a classic. I don't think.
Yeah, like, well, we'll see. We'll see about that. Because, I mean, people are changeable, and what's wildly popular at this moment won't necessarily be. I mean, 100 years ago, college students were wearing raccoon coats and swallowing live goldfish.
Yes.
That's not something people are saying. People do silly things, and taste is changeable.
It is.
Something new is not necessarily better, but novelty goes for a lot. I mean, why do we call it a novel? This is a new thing.
Right. Because it is new.
It is new.
And I just, so when I've done the book lists for my blog in the past, and I try to do crowdsource on the book lists, and it's been too long, and I should probably do another book list sometime soon. But I'll ask for classics of something, and then I'll get people telling me that something that was just published a couple years ago is a classic. And I'm like, there has to be a line there somewhere. I'm not sure how to define classic. It's one of those things of something that's endured the test of time, yes, but also I think that there can be classics that are newer than 100 years. I'm just not sure how to define it.
I do think that. And I think there's going to be a great eye of the beholder kind of element to that. And what's classic to me won't be to someone else. I mean, for some people, Heinlein is classic.
Yeah. And some people really like Hemingway.
Maybe you should go back and read that and
probably
decide.
Should.
And you may simply affirm that you were absolutely right when you were young to dislike him. I think he's a self-indulgent bastard. He seems like an unpleasant sort of person. And
I had such an argument with my English professor because, well, I mean, first of all, poor lady was working with a handicap whether it came to me. Because here I am. I'm in her class. I was about 38 when I hit her class. Mm-hmm. And she was she was a professor emeritus. Mm-hmm. So she had already been there, done that, was mostly retired, was teaching this one class because she wanted to. Mm-hmm. And she assigned a Hemingway story to us, and she wanted everyone to come to the same conclusion. And I would not. I knew what she wanted because it was very obvious from how she was pointing us at the story and the questions she was asking that she was funneling everyone towards one conclusion because it's oh my gosh, I can't remember the title of it. Something about elephants. But it's basically a vignette. It's a couple in a railway station, and they're having a conversation. And she wanted everyone to arrive at one conclusion because of the story, and it's difficult to even say it's a story because it doesn't. There's not really a beginning, a middle, and an end.
The one where she's talking about having a medical procedure and you don't know what it is.
Right.
That short story was one I started to assign to my students this semester. And this semester, in the middle of the semester, I changed the schedule and took it out and just put it in something else. Because I read it and I was so annoyed by it.
Yes, and I was annoyed by it. And so the conclusion that I gave her, with citations to back it up, because medical history, was that the young woman they were talking about her getting a lobotomy. Because that's very, very common at that time.
I just thought it was an abortion.
And then that's the conclusion that my professor wanted. Because, again, very, very common at that time and very controversial. But I was able to support it to go either way, and I went with the lobotomy, and she's like, "That's not what it was about." I'm like, "You don't know that. That's
Doesn't
the point."
yeah, that is exactly the point. Now I wouldn't
Hills like white elephants. Thank you.
yeah.
And the chat has provided that.
You know what? I don't. I tell my students that, and I would tell you. I would advise any student, read the room. When you go into a class, every teacher is going to be different. More than not, want you to, when they're asking for answers on a test, they are looking for a particular answer.
Yes.
What I tell them is I tell them that I don't expect them to perceive a story the same way that I do. But I will ask them questions that are objectively verifiable. You know, what happens after this happens in the story, or what is the outcome. I'm not asking them for an interpretation. I'm asking for what's literally in it.
Yeah.
And maybe objectively seen. But I tell them that in my class that I want them to, if I'm asking for their opinion on something, there are no wrong answers. There's only right and wrong form. I want them to present it in standard written English. It must be an MLA format because that is the state law for the course that I'm teaching in the case of, well, all the classes I teach. But
yeah.
But
and it helps to have a consistent format.
But I also tell them this in the hopes that it challenges them, because there are some students who are like, just tell me what you want me, just tell me what questions are going to be on the test.
That's not the point. You want them to think.
I want them to think. I want them to have their own perception of it. Maybe the story sucks and I'm wrong. You want to give me an essay that tells me how wrong I am about it. I welcome that. As long as it's well written and it's written in the proper form, I'm not taking it personally, even if you say it's because of me or something, because everyone's going to have a different perception of things. And I really respect that. I just want them to consider it. I want them to consider what we talk about. But I also tell them, if your teacher tells you, I absolutely want you to do this, then or think this, or this is what it's about, I tell them, do not fight it. Don't shuck your grade off by digging your heels in over something that just doesn't matter. Give them what they want. If they're saying they expect something very particular. But
I was just being cheeky, and my grade was in no danger. That class, actually, I was a little peeved because they wouldn't let me test out of that class.
Well, yeah.
But I mean, and she found out that I had my second novel published during the semester I was in her class, and she had just had her little slender volume out through a university press. She was not happy.
Yeah, well, that's a shame.
It was. I would really have enjoyed it. I actually took another class on Latin literature in the Americas. It was one of the global requirements. They had a pool of classes we had to take 9 credit hours from.
Did you study magical realism?
Yes. It was fun. I loved that class. And the professor in there was very warm and open, and she took me into some stuff that I would normally never have picked up and made it really enjoyable.
Yeah.
So it was just like polar opposites of how they were teaching. One wanted it to be, and the other was like, let's explore this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that and that fits those genres. It really does. I mean, but I think it's a terrible mistake to be slavishly devoted to being linear when it comes to literature. And and magical realism is amazing. Isabel Allende is a fantastic author, but my favorite is Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Yes.
And I think that, of my all-time favorite novels, one of the top 5 is definitely 100 Years of Solitude. And it's amazing. It's got one of the best opening lines ever. It's so good. Have you read it?
No, I haven't. Read some short stories of his, but not any of his novels. So.
It opens with a line, and again, here I go, I'm going to butcher. So sorry, we can look this up. There's something to the effect of, somebody can look it up and put it on there, and then
there we go.
Then Cedar can read it. But something to the effect of he would remember this all the day. Even when he was finally facing the firing squad, he would remember this day. And it's like, what? Yeah. He's going to end up in front of a firing squad? What's he going to do?
Yeah.
and everything. And
That's a great hook.
it really is. And then you go
Yeah.
through the whole book and like, he never is in front of the firing squad.
Oh, well,
I
that's
just gave it away, didn't I?
that's a little bit. I mean,
Did I ruin it for everybody? Spoiler alert. Sorry, you'll have to write spoiler alert on the title of this. So sorry.
I think there's a point when a book has been out long enough that you don't necessarily need to worry so much about spoilers anymore.
Good. Yeah. I mean, it's been a minute. That was what, the 1970s, 60s, or 70s.
Yeah.
But he was such an interesting cat. I mean, he wrote some amazing things. Columbia's produced some amazing artists. I love Botero, the sculptor painter.
Mm.
He made these big roundy form women. I'd say probably like a lot shaped like me, but very roundy women and men, just rotund and everything. I remember during I think it was the second Bill Clinton administration, he actually went down to Colombia, and there he was in Bogota, and they were squiring him around, and people were joking that these rotund sculptures of Boteros around the town of these naked, roundy ladies would not be safe with Bill Clinton in town. It was a funny thing. I thought it was kind of cute.
Oh no, that is hilarious.
Yeah.
So Ben Hunsinger says, I had a knockdown drag out over "She is not fair to outward view." The last couplet gripped me, and he was using it as an example of hack poetry. So I'm not familiar with what that's from, but I do like that line of "She is not fair to outward view."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it is a good line.
Inner beauty. Yeah, it's very nice.
So, actually, that could be taken in many different ways.
Yes. But that's the really lovely thing about some poetry is that it can, and some stories too, is that they can be taken in a lot of different ways. And
but that one is also like, my lover's eyes are nothing like the sun.
Yeah.
Shakespeare.
And yes, because I mean, always
my mistress eyes are nothing like the sun.
I think always we can come back to Shakespeare. And now there was a brilliant mind of just. I prefer poetry in shorter forms. Over the years of reading poetry, I've discovered two things. One, I much prefer it if I'm reading it out loud. I get it better than just reading it on the page or hearing it read. And two, I prefer shorter forms to some of the really epic page, Tennyson, take a breath. So you were talking about Emily Bronte, and I was thinking about Emily Dickinson's poetry as well, where just those short little, there's a lot of punch in that. So
it really is. Emily Dickinson was a huge fan of Elizabeth Browning, actually. Too.
Okay.
It's amazing how much reciprocity there was between English and American poets in the 19th century. In fact, Edgar Allan Poe and Charles Dickens were great friends. They corresponded mightily. And then I think they met when Dickens finally came to the United States the first time. And later on, they had a falling out. By the way, Dickens had a pet raven who would sit behind him, and he was fascinated by ravens as well as somebody else.
Yes.
And they had great. I like to think this was a great theme of their correspondence, and but they would talk about the ravens. And when later on in Poe's life, Poe only lived to be 40, I think.
Yeah,
and but I think he was born in 1909 and died in 1949, and Dickens was born in 1912, so they were contemporaries age-wise and everything. And then Dickens lived until 1870, and they were kind of running parallel in a way, and they corresponded quite a bit. They had a falling out after they fell out. He was no longer, and then Poe died. Dickens came back to America for his second time, and at the time he tracked down Poe's mother-in-law, who was destitute, ill, and living in a poorhouse, and he bequeathed her enough money to live on for the rest of her life out of as a tribute to his friendship with Poe,
Wow.
which I think is a stand-up thing to do.
Yeah, it is. And it's interesting because I had seen an argument based on medical stuff that Poe may have died of rabies.
Yeah, I've heard that too. It's interesting. Yeah, it's kind of sad, but also I mean people have speculated.
Oh yeah, but there's a lot of and it's so easy to speculate and so hard to actually prove anything.
It's so sad that what was I going to say? One thing that was remarkable about Dickens, and he was incredibly prolific, but he was so many of the great writers were people of the middle class or upper and wealthy. He worked in a blacking factory. He was forced to work as a child.
Yeah.
So he knew whereof he spoke when he was talking about the injustices in society and the sad little Cratchit family and everything. He mixed with all types, and that's why he was so prolific with characters. He brought these worlds to life. He was remarkable. And at the time he was alive, he was the most famous human on earth. And his works were translated into so many languages in his lifetime. He was a rock star. He was untouchable. Yeah. And it's weird. It's weird to think of that level of fame and success, and where you just can go anywhere. And there, I mean, he had to have a perception of no limits to him. Yeah. But he had a friend. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the artists. They were poets and artists. They believe.
I don't remember who all was in that.
The Rossetti, the Rossetti brothers, were they?
I think it was, yes.
Other William Morris in there, the whole gang of people. They were really interesting.
Some wonderful stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But Rossetti, one of the Rossetti brothers, had a wife, and he was friends with Dickens, and he. There's almost no extant notes or letters from Dickens that are in collections, because when Rossetti died, he'd fooled around on his wife very much, and when he died,
I think a lot of that gang did.
I think that
they were very bohemian.
Goes with the territory. Yeah. Little laudanum comes in, a little a little excess,
a little open.
Yeah. He but he when his wife died, he felt guilty. And it's thought that she killed herself. Oh. And so what he did was he took a volume of his unpublished work, and he put it in the coffin with her to be buried. And it was buried. And then 7 years later, it was not widely known that Rossetti approved that way, but he was watching from a distance. Because he had to sign a paper for her body to be exhumed, they dug up her coffin to pull out what he wrote, so they could see what is this brilliant thing that he's written. And
oh my gosh,
what an arrogant ass! I mean, he was involved with it. When I first heard that story, someone speculated to me that he had no idea, or even that it was done after he died. But no, he apparently was aware of it.
Oh wow!
And they dug this up, and when Dickens heard about this, he was so mortified that he took all of his notes and letters and made a bonfire and burned all of his crap. And he apparently had a bonfire about 3 times. I think that was about 1860. Yeah. And then then a succession of bonfires.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because we were talking about actors and how they're a little strange, and I think that goes for a lot of just celebrities in general, whether or not it's confirmation bias because they're under the scrutiny. They're news. What they did was news.
Well, there's no one to talk about performers better than Jonna. Yeah, because she's I'm sure you all heard her say that tenors are a real special breed. Sopranos are special too, but she said they're easy compared to tenors. But that they're always on. I read actually. I asked her about this because I've read somewhere online someone was talking about they were a makeup artist and that it was kind of pitiful. It didn't matter how attractive or refined a performer seemed when they would get in her makeup chair, they felt like they had to be performing and charming and the center of everything, and that male actors were really, really needy narcissists who had maybe had some childhood trauma that broke them completely.
And it's funny because so I get to stand in both worlds as a professional entertainer for almost 20 years and going through and becoming a scientist and then working in the science field. And there are reasons that there are stereotypes about artists and about scientists.
Yeah.
And it really is, it's funny because looking at that from both sides, there are stereotypes that are both positive and negative, and they hold true. And it's not that they can't be both, because goodness knows at this point I'm both a scientist and an artist, so I can be both a flake and absent-minded. But Andy the Axe says, we had a mystery person leave a bottle of cognac and roses on Poe's grave for decades, finally stopped in the late 2000s.
Wow.
That's interesting.
Wow.
Yeah. A long, and I'm going to guess that it was probably a fan. And but it seems like there's a lot, if you go and you look at the authors that were really amazing. Robert Howard killed himself and died in penury, but he was this brilliant author, but also had serious mental health issues. And I mean, he just comes to mind because we were just talking about making the pilgrimage to the little town here in Texas that's a couple hours away from us, and going over there to see the house that he lived in. But it's that if you look, there's this theme of these brilliant minds that ended too early. And in the 19th century, a lot of the times that was consumption. And because tuberculosis is highly contagious.
It is. In fact, I was looking this up last week when I was researching the Brontes, and there are some scientific bodies today who estimate that roughly 1/4 of the world has TB. It's not always in a flare up. It's not always in a deadly state, and it can be managed with medicine too. But
well, yes and no. Go on.
I mean, the thing is that once you have it, you always have it.
No, actually, unless it's the drug resistant, you can absolutely treat it with antibiotics.
How cool.
But there is multi-drug resistant
but it's
tuberculosis that does not have a treatment because it's resistant to everything that we know that works against mycoplasma, which is the bacteria that causes it. Tuberculosis is strange in a couple of ways. One, it's really the smallest genome of like anything, because it's so tiny, the organism is itself really, really small, which means that it can be airborne and remain airborne for up to a week. Which is why it's so highly contagious. And people talk about they were talking about the pandemic with COVID-19, and I'd be like, which pandemic are you talking about? Because we have 3 active ones at the time, which would be, of course, AIDS, COVID-19 there for a time, and we're well past the pandemic stage on that now. It's endemic. But the other one is multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and most people have no idea how many people in the world. Africa has been decimated by it. Because it's just, you can't treat that one. You can just, the consumption of the 19th century we could treat, but there's definitely strains that we can't treat. So, and yes, Kortnee says that she has aspirations of kissing Oscar Wilde's grave and leaving a pen at Douglas Adams's, and leaving tribute for those who inspired her feels important. And my mom says, like all the people who still to this day leave coins on the grave of Mother Goose in Boston. I've seen those, so they're there's a little bare spot in the ground, and people just leave coins and they touch it so much that the grass doesn't grow right for this like little square spot right in front of this little rickety old gravestone in Boston. And which is another thing. I don't know if children these days grow up with Mother Goose.
Yeah.
I know that I own several editions that go back well into antique status, but I read some of them to my kids. But I don't know that kids these days grow up with Mother Goose at all. Some of the poems, of course, are no longer politically correct. But
yeah, it's amazing how much is canceled. Yeah.
But in an era when we didn't have television or radio, poetry was important because it's easier to memorize. And it could be sung.
Yeah, that's true.
And singing makes data sticky.
It does.
And laughing.
It does help. It does help.
I always, when I was designing educational shows to entertain with, I was trying to work in both singing and laughing because it makes the information sticky. And that's so the concept of sticky data. Have you come across that?
No, but I know that singing is much easier for me than I can remember lyrics, even non-English ones. I can vast swaths of arias. I can remember that, but like I said, I'll butcher a 12-line poem. But no sticky data. I'm not. Is that a new concept?
It's something I came across. There's a book about becoming an effective teacher. And her concept of the brain is it's like a colander. You have constant millions and millions of bits of information coming into your brain all the time, from the temperature around you to the light to the color of the walls. And you can't possibly, if your brain's a bowl, it's going to fill up and overflow, and you're going to lose everything. So if the brain's a colander, most of that data that's bombarding you flows through. Your mind knows that it doesn't need to hold on to the walls are white, the lights are on. This is information that you process and it just drops right out again. And this is why if you're stressed and you're commuting home, you'll sometimes, at least I have had this happen, you left work, you're at home, but you don't remember any of that in between stuff. Because your brain was like, that's not important. We've done this a million times. Unless a deer jumped out in front of you that day on your drive, you don't remember it. Your brain just lets it go through. So to learn something new, you have to figure out a way to make that data sticky. So it doesn't just flow through and fall out. And things that make the data sticky are tying it to experiences, especially for kinetic learners where they're doing something, but also laughter and song. And some people mnemonics work for.
Yeah, mnemonics work really well for me, but and I'm definitely a kinesthetic learner. But the problem for me is I can't usually use a mnemonic that somebody else came up with. I need to make up my own.
Yes.
Is that weird?
No, it's not, because I had the same issue. It's like I can remember one mnemonic, which is chomps, which is because it's it's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, potassium, and sulfate, and it's the most prevalent elements that make up the human body. And I think I remember it just because I associate it with Pac-Man. Chomping.
I like that.
Even though it's an N, not an M. But most mnemonics don't work for me. So I'm like you, I have to make them up myself.
Do they happen in that one in the order of prevalence?
No, I don't think so. I think they got rearranged that way too, because I mean, potassium and sulfur are both very minute, but very critical. And calcium isn't even mentioned in that, which is another one that's critical for the body. So it's lacking, but it's the only one I could just like pull out of the top of my head and say, okay, I remember this. So, and sometimes you have to remember things to memorize things. So, had a great description of how a chemistry instructor's brain worked. a block of skyscrapers, always under construction for each major topic, with ropes to swing from one building to another to get to something related. And they are on fire.
That helps.
Always building, but always going away at the same time. Which kind of, yeah, that's how knowledge is, at least for me. I'm always forgetting things.
It's not static
No,
at all.
no, it's not. And there's a lot of data, a lot of studies on mental agility and how if you use your brain, if you exercise it just like your muscles, you will keep it in for longer and in better condition. Where if you stop learning, then your brain stops being able to learn.
I want you to go back and read that Hemingway and see what you think of it. You'll probably be like me and you'll probably be absolutely sure.
But I will bring something different to it. So I found, I'm trying to remember now which book it was, but it was a book I had read as a child, as a teenager, and then again as a mother. And every time I came away with something totally different.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking it was probably one of Lucy Maud Montgomery's books, one of either Anne of Green Gables, but more likely one of my more favorites of hers. So Jane of Lantern Hill, or The Blue Castle, which I adore. I think The Blue Castle may be my favorite of hers. And as a girl, I identified more with the young characters in the book. But as a mother coming into it, I was very anxious about the young characters in the book doing things that were maybe putting them in a dangerous situation. So I know that I can come back to a book after a matter of decades and come at it completely differently.
It's funny. It's funny to revisit something you thought was so amazing when you were very young and just the best thing ever, and then you go back and look at it, and you're kind of like, you're either like, man, or what was I thinking? And that, it's kind of embarrassing, but it's actually kind of wonderful. I mean, it doesn't matter. It was something to me at that moment. It had meaning and merit in that way. But I'm not judging.
No.
But it's funny. Here's a terrible confession. I've never read Catcher in the Rye, but I think it's one of those that appeals to very young people. Not really. Forgive me. I don't mean to offend anyone, and I would never say this to a class of students, because I definitely don't want to color their perception of things, because taste is like belly buttons or whatever. You get
somebody
to like,
has innies and somebody has outies.
You get to like what you like, and that's legitimate. But based on the themes of it, I mean, it sounds like a coming of age thing to me, and it also, it seems to me that it's something that appeals to people who feel awkward or in an awkward place, either in their headspace or in life, in their social situations, that I hope that they outgrow, and that maybe later on they go back. I mean, is anyone in the chat a fan of Catcher in the Rye who's read it over and over, or reads it every September 14th or something like that?
We'll give them a second to respond. Kortnee says, you're an adult when you start sympathizing with the parents in kids' movies.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like every Charlie Brown. Blah, 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 blah. But I say that to my students sometimes. They don't even know what Charlie Brown is anymore.
Oh, that's funny, because when I was a librarian, we had to replace the Charlie Brown books all the time. They got taken out, checked out by children, and read until they were in danger of falling apart. I love the fact that they were perennial. And the movies, maybe not so much, the films. Yeah,
that's true. Maybe that's it. Because that is...
I think they still resonate in some ways. I was going to say, Pixar does a really wonderful job of doing parenting and childhood, but Pixar does these great multi-level movies that I think you can watch at different ages and all appreciate the same thing. Because I know that there was things that I was watching with my kids that they weren't getting bits of it, and I was. And the first 8 minutes of Up were probably the best love story.
Oh my gosh, I wept like a baby in the theater at Up. Oh, the scene You know the one. Every time just wrecks me.
Yes.
Really, really wrecks me. It's so good. It's so beautifully done. It's magnificent.
It is. And that's the kind of thing that we can study as a writer. And
you are hooked. And wherever the balloons are going, you're taking that ride with them.
Oh yeah.
They pull you in so beautifully.
Kortnee says, Catcher in the Rye is for disillusioned young men. It's the generation or two before Fight Club and appealed to the same people. That's interesting.
Tyler Durden.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have not seen Fight Club the movie. I watched an episode. I should. I've had it spoiled for me. So I watched an episode of Cinema Therapy that was on it and was delving into the psychology of it. And found out the basic premise that's underscoring the movie, which actually made me want to then go see it because it sounded a whole lot more interesting than I thought Fight Club was about in the first place.
Yeah.
So now I'm like, oh, I actually kind of want to see that now.
The author who wrote that, you need to Chuck Pahuliak. How do you say it? I'm not sure how you say it.
I'm not sure how you say it either.
There's some great clips on YouTube of him with Joe Rogan. That is an odd cat. He's a very special case. He's really he's fascinating. He's a brilliant man and incredible.
Yeah.
And another author I really wish he would have on is it Irvine Welsh or something? The guy who wrote Trainspotting.
No.
He's interesting. He's an interesting author. But the neat thing about these outsider kind of stories is that they sort of make us think about things from another angle. Yeah. You know, and I mean, Trainspotting, they did a great job in the film of bringing that to life. The book is tough. The movie is really tough because there's some terrible visuals and in it. It's all fiction, but he was on. I heard him on Fresh Air. I'm sorry, all my anecdotes are. I heard this author talking once. Sorry about that, but it's true. But he was talking about a life-changing experience, and this is apropos of nothing. I'm just chasing a rabbit here. You can fire me after this show. He was saying that he was living in a flop house in London, and he hadn't sold any writing yet, and everything he owned was in one little box. Whatever photos, remnants of his childhood or life before was just gone. And he was living there squatting with a bunch of other people who were squatting in this abandoned house. And he said he was walking and, you know, he had so little, you know, he'd gone out. I think he'd gone out to collect his UB40, get his dole payment from the government. And he came walking down the street, and there was a hullabaloo down the street near the house where he was squatting and everything. And he said he was walking up and he's realized the house was on fire and that everything he owned, that one little box of stuff that he had been holding on and dragging around wherever he went and everything, all burned up. He had nothing left, absolutely nothing of his life before. Yeah. And he said it was actually, he came to realize it was the best thing that ever happened to him. Just he was starting from absolute nothing, absolute zero. And it liberated him in a way.
And I've heard a lot of people make comments similar to that of when they lost everything, it gave them freedom in a way. And Casey Azell says that it's pronounced Palhamic.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Casey. Yeah. So it's one of those things that you were talking about. You were saying that you feel like your anecdotes start with, I heard this author talk about, but we take these random bits that we've heard or we've read, and then we can take them and make connections in a different way than anyone else can, because each of us is unique in that we can't all have the exact same experiences, the exact same reactions to things.
It's all this nurturing the intellect and the creative brain and everything. And C.S. Lewis said, we read to know we're not alone.
Yes.
And I absolutely think that. I think that
if you haven't read it, Dorothy and Jack is wonderful. It's the story of the friendship between Dorothy Sayers and C.S. Lewis.
Was that the? Uh, no, I haven't read it.
It's recent, and it basically it goes over their letters. They wrote a lot to each other, but it goes over their letters back and forth, and it was a really interesting friendship because it was a very intellectual friendship, and they were both married into other people, and there was no romantic thing there, which is also one of the things I really enjoyed, and the reason I picked it up because Dorothy Sayers is one of my favorite authors. I love her stuff, and um, so reading this, and I also enjoy Lewis a lot. But going and reading this, it was more the interesting of I wanted to see that intellectual friendship without the overlay of it had to have all been about sex because it's not always, and I get annoyed at that perception a lot of times.
So how did they meet?
So they were both Oxford, and I mean she wasn't Oxford because they weren't allowed, women weren't allowed, but they wrote on some of the same topics, and so they corresponded about those things, and that evolved into this friendship between them, and they both were to some extent Christian apologists, but not necessarily in the same way and from the same direction. And they actually clashed about that, which for me was really interesting to read because that realm of writing fascinates me. Of doing it well, it's very difficult.
Yeah, he was magnificent at that.
Yes.
In fact, if you whether or not you're a Christian, the Screw Tape Letters is superb. Yes. It's so good, and it's a story of it's basically it's letters from Satan saying, if I'm going to destabilize the world, here's how I do it. And I think that I'd love to see what he would make of what's going on in the world right now.
And it's a brilliant. It's the twisted tropes. It really is, and because it's a brilliant inversion of what was often done at that time. And I mean, even to some extent, the Gospels, or the not the Gospels, the letters part of the New Testament. So he's taken it and he's gone, in this whole other direction. But his understanding, his insight into the way the human mind works is absolutely worth reading, whether or not you're going to be looking at it from the scope of being a Christian or not. He understood the human heart very well.
Absolutely. And I think one of my all-time favorite films, and this is saying a lot, I've seen a lot of films. One of my all-time favorite films is Shadowlands, which is a depiction of C.S. Lewis and his ultimate wife, who's an American. And she's played by Deborah Winger, and C.S. Lewis is played by Anthony Hopkins. So superbly. It's one of the most beautiful and gut-wrenching films. Yes. It's so gorgeous.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think they really captured the spirit of him and the lively spark of their correspondence and their friendship, and how she was a breath of fresh air for him, and all the other scholars are there, and she's coming in. She's like, "How you doing?" She's an American. She's Deborah Winger, and everybody's like, "Oh, look what the cat dragged in." But it really, they worked. They were really, really such a fine compliment.
Yeah,
it's a wonderful film.
And I find these days that I'm reading a lot of nonfiction and enjoying it, whereas when I was younger, I was much more heavily into the fiction. And the other thing, I never used to read like biographies and autobiographies, and I'm slowly finding myself enjoying more of them. So I don't know. Again, it's that perception change, the perspective change as we get older.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how that is fluid through your life.
It is.
So
it is.
Yeah, and I think. Ben Hunsinger points out that C.S. Lewis said the Screw Tape was once the easiest and the hardest thing he ever wrote. And Doug Irvin points out that Shadowlands' most romantic movie I've ever seen, and it only had a single kiss.
Yeah, it's wonderful. When he cried, I boo-hooed at the end. I cried like a baby. I cried like I was watching Up. It was just amazing. It's beautiful. It is a gorgeous film.
And Doug also points out that a grief observed has helped him tremendously. And Doug lost his wife just a few short years ago. So I can imagine that it did. And I think that's the other thing, too, is that we go through seasons of life where what we're reading changes.
Well, one of the things that I'm emphasizing in my course, sorry to go back to that, but
No, please do.
but one of the things that I'm absolutely going to get to next week is there was a very brief little essay that C.S. Lewis wrote. I think it was in the 1950s when somebody asked him, "Well, aren't you just terrified of the bomb? How are we going to live with the nuke threat, the nuclear threat?" And he goes on and he wrote this just elegant, brilliant little piece like, we're going to go to the bakery and the butcher, and we're going to live as we do, and we'll live the way people did when the Black Death came, when all of these things happened, in the past. What if did they just stop living? Did they really just give up and throw up their hands? They didn't.
No.
You press on. You suck it up and get on with it, and get on with the business of living.
Yeah.
And that's important. And I feel like, especially in this age, I feel like the lighthearted touch that I bring to my class, I try to bring where I'm looking at this and saying, look, these people went through some crap, because we looked at the Great Fire and the Great Plague. We've done all this stuff.
Yeah.
And then I've looked at the march of human rights, starting with the Magna Carta, and then, through all of the abolitionist material and everything, and women's rights, and in the 19th century, especially, and into the 20th. I feel like this is all a progression. It's baby steps. And I feel like they need to understand that even if things are not ideal, if things are not perfect, or there are injustices, we can't make a giant stride in one direction without really destabilizing things, that things do happen best in increments. And that it's all going to be okay. People have been through some awful crap. We're going to go through more awful crap. It's inevitable.
Yeah.
But that we have to have some internal strength with which to face this stuff.
Yeah.
And we can get angry about this or that situation, but in the end, they still need to go out and have their babies and have their wonderful lives, and find the joy. Look at the butterflies and watch the majesty of the incredible weather, or the scenery, the landscape, or just the wonder of like laying on the grass and watching bugs creeping around and smelling the earth. The joy of getting dirt under your fingernails when you're gardening. This is all what adds to the rich pageantry of life. And even the banal, even the tiny experiences are amazing. You look at Wordsworth's I wandered lonely as a cloud, which is also called Daffodils. He talks about later on, and he will always, that moment is frozen in time. He just sees this sea of daffodils, and it's fed his spirit for the rest of his life. And he can always just check out of the moment and go back into that space.
Yeah.
And I think there's so much to learn from that.
Yes,
absolutely. I think that there's room for more writing like that. I think there's room for more people to have that experience and share it with other people. And even if there's not a huge passion for poetry, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do that if that's your thing, if that's what you need to do. Someone in the world needs to read it, or maybe somebody needs to read it to their students in 200 years.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll never be known for your poetry, but if it's what you've got to do, do it. Do it. You should.
Yes, and I love that, the idea of just finding the beauty wherever you are. And I was doing that. I was trying to find something beautiful to photograph every day. Daily life was a challenge, but it teaches you how to see. So then you look, and after a while it becomes a habit, and you see that without having to work at it so much. And I think that that's a worthwhile exercise, is to learn how to see.
Yeah.
And to learn how to see the beauty and to find the joy.
I think so. And I think part of the trick of that is unhooking the constant judge that's going along, that inner voice that's like going, no, you can't do that, or you shouldn't do that, or nobody wants to read what you've written, or that's stupid. Why would you go waste time looking at bugs laying on the grass? But
I go out with my macro lens and I go bug hunting.
Yeah.
and it makes me happy. I mean, Sanford will occasionally be like, "So, when you want to go out and look at bugs?" And it's not that he's going to come out with me. He's reminding me I haven't done this in a while, and maybe I need to.
You need some bug therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm kind of a dork, though. I think.
I don't think that's it, though. I really don't think that you're a dork, first of all. And second of all, I think that for every one of us, it's different.
Mm-hmm.
There's no norm.
Mm-hmm.
We can't be normal.
Yeah. I was always the odd one. And I didn't realize I'm an odd child until I was in my second time in 8th grade. And my math teacher, Mr. McDonald, I was new that semester. It was the first week of school, and maybe it was the silver shoes. I don't know. It was my first week in a school in Texas, and I was a little bit, my look was on point though because I had those silver shoes. It was I was so pimping, and that I was. I guess I struck him as a little nutty because he said. One day I was sitting there in class and he throws a piece of chalk and it hits me squarely. I'm like, what? He said, "You." He like points at me and I'm like, what? And he was kind of like John Lovitz from Saturday Night Live,
Mm-hmm.
You are the person in this room most likely to end up wearing hats with fruit on them. And he was right. He was absolutely right.
Oh.
Fruit early, fruit often, I say.
You shall know them by their fruit.
Yeah.
And on that note, because we've gone we've gone more than a little bit long.
Sorry, folks.
We were having fun and I wasn't looking at the time. I can't see the time on the big monitor. Well, we will thank you all very much for coming and listening to us and participating in the chat. And next week, there will be the episode will have been pre-recorded, so we will do part 2 of the romance novel, Unbagging. And we really appreciate you keeping us company while we chatted, because this was a lot of fun.
It was.
Thank you so much, Rita.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everybody.
All right, folks, have a good night.
Bye.
Okay, now I have to figure out where.
It's one of those things.
What am I doing?
Wouldn't it be funny if we just kept laughing?